Can you see this book? It's one of my favorites. It's called Patterns of Prejudice, A History of Nativism in Alberta by Howard Palmer. See that picture there? Those are Ukrainians. Those are Ukrainians trying to look like they're British. And eventually, as you read this book, they actually look. They're not British. They're Ukrainians, culturally, ethnically, linguistically. Russians. Maybe they're Russians. Ukrainian Russians, Czechoslovakians, Eastern Europeans. They're not all the same, but if you want to be racist, you could say they all look alike. They're white. But some of my cousins and family look pretty white as well. They're not Ukrainians. But they could pass if you're a racist. So I thought I would just read some passages out of here for you. I just want to start off with the introduction by Howard Palmer, I guess it is. It says here, Canadians hold at least two conflicting images of the history and place of ethnic minorities in Canadian life. One image suggests that Canada is a mosaic where ethnic groups have lived together in harmony, each cherishing its distinctive way of life. In contrast to the melting pot of the United States, where ethnic groups have lost their distinctive identities, proponents of this view can point to the multicultural policies of both the federal and various provincial governments introduced during the 1970s as the most recent indication of official approval for the mosaic ideal. The other assessment of the place of ethnic minorities in Canadian society points out that the mosaic ideal is of recent vintage and is far from being universally acclaimed. Further, it asserts that at the level of mundane reality, there has been a strong current of prejudice and racism in Canadian national life. Racism? Really? Please. According to this view, when ethnic minorities have been able to maintain distinctive lifestyles in Canada, it has not been due primarily to official or unofficial encouragement, but rather to their own will to survive in the face of prejudice and discrimination. Proponents of this interpretation point to the deluge of opposition to non-white immigration during the nationwide debate on the federal government's 1975 Green Paper on immigration as recent evidence of racism and enforced conformity in contemporary Canadian society. So they've been talking about racism since 1975 and before. And yet it's 2021. 2021. So that's pretty well 45 years ago. Just about. Not giving away my age or anything, but let's see here. All right. Chapter 1, Strangers and Stereotypes. The Rise of Nativism, 1880 to 1920. That's chapter 1. It's an introduction. Most of the basic assumptions concerning immigration and ethnic groups which shaped Albertan attitudes throughout the first half of the 20th century emerged during the province's era of early settlement. Following a period of slow economic and population growth, Alberta emerged from the late 1890s until the outbreak of World War I as one of North America's major new agricultural frontiers. And I drove you through that, and you've seen it. Hang on here. See if I can hold this better, get a little bit of a better grip on my boobly. Now, where were we? All right. The face of Alberta was transformed as immigrant farmers took up most of the arable land in the southern half of the province. The face of Alberta was transformed as immigrant farmers took up most of the arable land in the southern half of the province. Merchants, tradesmen, professional people, and promoters, most of whom hailed either from Eastern Canada or the British Isles, founded literally hundreds of towns and villages. New transcontinental railway lines pushed across the province, opening up new farming, coal mining, and lumbering areas. A network of railway branch lines was developed, determining where town sites would go, supplying townspeople and farmers with goods, and taking wheat to the markets of the world. Edmonton, Calgary, Lethbridge, and Medicine Hat grew from towns to respectably sized cities, with aggressive commercial elites and the beginnings of small industries. The new growth also brought a change in political status. In 1905, the federal Liberal government carved Alberta out of the Northwest Territories, and in the subsequent provincial election, the provincial Liberal Party easily defeated the Conservatives and began a 16-year reign of power. Out of the major immigration boom from 1896 to 1913 emerged the basic settlement patterns, ethnic composition, and class structure of Alberta that would shape ethnic relations in the province for decades. In a society made up overwhelmingly of new immigrants, in 1911, less than 20% of the population was Alberta born. Some newcomers, particularly those from English-speaking countries, felt almost immediately at home. Others, notably those from Central and Eastern Europe and Asia, would find acceptance an uphill struggle. Despite the relative prosperity and optimism of these boom years, ethnic conflict was at times intense, and stereotypes abounded as people from diverse backgrounds attempted to make sense of one another and establish relationships in a new society. The pattern of ethnic relations was certainly not uniform across the province. Urban centers provided more fertile ground for the development of nativism than rural areas. In the rural communities, rural, I'm trying to read here, where people were scattered across an immense area, where farmers faced the common task of pioneering, and where almost everyone was a newcomer, indifference or intolerance rather than prejudice was usually the prevailing mood. In the urban areas, universally dominated by Anglo-Saxon Protestants, a middle class that concerned itself with social issues developed. A middle class that concerned itself with social issues developed. That's how it reads. With their ideal of society based on British Protestant principles, many became uneasy over the type of social vices and problems that seemed to be associated with the new frontier. For reform-minded citizens in Alberta, emerging... I think I'm still learning how to read here. For reform-minded citizens in Alberta, emerging urban centers For reform-minded citizens in Alberta, emerging urban centers, prostitution, crime, the use of alcohol, and non-Anglo-Saxon immigration were seen as interrelated social problems that needed to be met if Alberta and Canada were to become the societies they envisaged. By the time of the 1911 census, 40% of the population was of non-British origin, with sizable German, Scandinavian, and Central and Eastern European minorities. See, I've been talking about this book as we drive through Canada, and I've been explaining this as best I could. So I thought I would just take some time to read a couple of passages here for you. And I'm just going to carry on here. Thus, whether they liked it or not, those Albertans who concerned themselves with the future of the province, whether in their roles as politicians, journalists, educators, clergymen, or community leaders, had to come to grips with the obvious fact of ethno-cultural diversity. Immigration was an important political issue of the day, often surfacing as a feature of intense partisan struggle between the conservatives and the liberals. Immigration was also often linked with another event of growing political significance, the emergence of the labor movement. Particularly in the province's coal mining areas, organized labor relied heavily on the support of non-Anglo-Saxons. A number of violent strikes in which non-Anglo-Saxons appeared to play a prominent part served to solidify the image held by many Albertans of the unruly, conflict-prone immigrant whose presence seemed to precipitate class conflict. How dare you strike against me? I will crush you. It's rather Putinesque. Okay, so here's something else I've been talking about. Let me just read this to you real quick. All right. Let's. In a society made up overwhelmingly of new immigrants, and this is in parentheses, in 1911, less than 20% of the population was Alberta-born. Some newcomers, particularly those from English-speaking countries, felt almost immediately at home. Others, notably those from Central and Eastern Europe and Asia, would find acceptance an uphill struggle. Okay, so I read that to you already, but I'll go to the next paragraph. The pattern of ethnic relations was certainly not uniform across the province. I read that to you as well. I recognize the issue here. I got something else picked out here for you. All right. Not all immigrants who arrived during the 1880s or early 1890s, however, were met with open hearts. A heated press and political debate developed over the desirability of polygamous Mormon farmers who had come from Utah to southwestern Alberta beginning in 1887. What did they say? Polygamous Mormon farmers. Polygamous Mormon farmers. What's that? Do we still have that problem today? Polygamy? Anyways. Police and local citizens in Lethbridge, the earliest coal mining community in the province, also worried about the unruliness of Hungarian and Slavic miners who had come to work there during the 1880s. Calgarians' hostility toward Chinese laundrymen culminated in an anti-Chinese riot in Calgary in 1892. At a time when the town had a population of approximately 4,000, the riot was triggered by the outbreak of smallpox among a few of the city's Chinese residents. The public mood turned ugly after a few whites also came down with the disease. A few whites also came down with the disease, and 3 died. After the release of the Chinese from a police medical quarantine on the evening of August 2, 300 men, subsequent to a cricket match between 2 local clubs, followed by a dinner at which some of the participants got drunk, attacked the Chinese laundries, hoping to run the Chinese out of town. They badly wrecked one of the laundries and visited 3 others, where they roughed up the Chinese proprietors and cut off their pigtails. The town police did not appear during the early stages of the riot, perhaps because the mayor was in sympathy with the rioters. Only after the eventual appearance of the mounted police, who began making arrests, did the crowd disperse. That's a story we're quite familiar with today. And this occurred in the 1880s. So, yeah. In this book, he talks about how the Calgary Herald was used as a herald of racism. The media, really? Please. All right, I got one more here. One more passage, and then we'll go to bed for the night, huh? All right, it says, it's hard to read out loud when you're thirsty. Liking my peach flavored boobly. All right. Oh, this is a good one. You're gonna like this one. In assessing the reaction of Albertans to new groups of immigrants, it is virtually impossible to disentangle the initially negative ethnocentric reaction to different peoples from negative reactions based on formal racist thinking. Certainly, racism was on the rise in the late 19th century as Darwinism combined with anthropology to produce an array of schemata about the biological and social evolution of man. The school of social Darwinism, which grew out of the writings of English intellectual and close associate of Darwin, Herbert Spencer. Pay attention to that part. You might even want to come back and listen to this. It's around the 1745. Herbert Spencer, hang on, contributed to the growing current of anthropological thought which argued that biology determined cultural capability. It's my boobly. In their judgments of different groups, some Albertans drew upon the Spencerian emphasis on racial characteristics and upon notions of the superiority of Anglo-Saxons to judge potential immigrants on the basis of their racial background. Well, I'm definitely not in that category. But their ideas on these questions were seldom clearly developed. Notions of racial superiority and cultural superiority were hopelessly confused, and it still is, but not if you believe in this shit. White is white, black is black, red is red, brown is brown, but look at me. Do I look red to you? Consequently, the relative mix of racism and ethnocentrism in Albertans' reactions to various groups is indeterminate. The Alberta elite, as elsewhere on the prairies, regarded British and American immigrants as the most desirable settlers. The British, who comprised the largest group of immigrants to Canada at this time, were usually considered the most desirable because of their similar cultural background. They obviously fit in with the prevailing conception of what type of society ought to emerge in Alberta, British immigrants came from virtually every stratum of British society and found their way into almost all fields of endeavor in Alberta. However, most were concentrated in the urban areas. Because of the similarity of their cultural background to that of other Canadians, they hardly seemed to be immigrants in the usual sense. They were rarely tagged with opprobrious names, and there was little pressure on them to conform to a Canadian norm. In fact, the more wealthy British were often regarded as models for upper middle class Canadians who were proud of British traditions and looked to England for standards of taste. Despite the general esteem in which British immigrants were held, approval was not universal. The English came in for some criticism. Oh, really? Much of it was related to doubts about the English immigrants' ability to make the physical and cultural sacrifices required by a pioneer society. The social elite of the province might have had the idea that only British immigrants should be encouraged, but at the grassroots level there was a strong current of feeling among many farm people, even among many of English ancestry themselves, that Englishmen were snobs and troublemakers in the community and worthless as farmers or farmhands. The technical ignorance and laziness of some of the remittance men were proverbial. The immigration of unemployed British workers in 1907 and 1908 to Western Canadian cities also aroused hostility from labor organizations on the prairies. The antagonism toward the English, though, was certainly minor compared to that aroused by other European and Asian immigrants. All right. 20 minutes of video, 21 minutes. So I've been talking about this. And what the message of what I'm trying to say is, you know, when the architects of Canadian society decided we're going to assimilate the Indians, well, we weren't the only ones that got assimilated. Anybody who came to Canada was assimilated, and you would think you were assimilated into a system that is civilized and progressive and advances society, but you weren't. You were assimilated into something that was in the imagination of people. It wasn't real. They imagined a society they wanted, but it had nothing to do with reality. So you could call that visionary, you could call that you could use all the fancy words, but in reality, what we call that in psychology is delusional. You're trying to create a society that is based on delusion. It's not real. These are your vision doesn't match with reality. That's the problem. So if you wanted to create, so what they were trying to create, according to Howard Palmer, is that they wanted to create this ideal society that resembled Britain, England, the English Empire. In their minds, they were already assimilated. They had already become convinced that the British Empire was the greatest empire the world has ever seen. But that's because they were assimilated. And they were coerced into thinking that. But also, it pays to think that. It pays well. And so, when you're motivated to feed your family, to advance your goals without frustration and aggression, but That's impossible. They advance their goals with a lot of frustration, a lot of aggression, and our history is full of that racism and prejudice. But we'll keep reading. Hopefully you stick around. You'll see my videos. I'm going to be showing you proof. I'm going to be driving through Quebec tomorrow and Ontario, and you'll see the differences. The British weren't even nice to themselves. They have their own class system. So not all British benefited, but they did benefit, but all British benefited. Just some more than others. All right. You have yourself a good night.